The difference between a dead engine and a running engine is often one detail that everyone else stopped looking for. By the time the luxury dealership gave up, the car had become something people avoided discussing. It sat alone in the center service bay beneath bright white lights, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of equipment and some of the most experienced technicians in the state. The vehicle itself was extraordinary, rare, powerful, valuable enough that every additional day of failure cost money, reputation, and patience. Yet none of that mattered because the engine refused to come alive. Victoria Hayes stood on the second-floor observation deck overlooking the service department. As chief executive officer of the dealership group, she had spent weeks listening to updates that never changed. More diagnostics, more testing, more theories. No solution. The technicians below were talented professionals. She knew that. Many had spent years building reputations that attracted customers from across the country. Yet even they were beginning to run out of answers. One technician suggested replacing another major component. Another believed the issue originated somewhere deeper inside the electrical architecture. A third argued that previous repairs had created conflicting data that made proper diagnosis nearly impossible. Every theory sounded reasonable. Every theory failed. Victoria crossed her arms and looked through the glass. The vehicle remained silent, motionless, defeated. Somewhere on the service floor, a technician shook his head and closed another diagnostic tablet. Another gathered tools and walked away. The atmosphere had changed over the past month. What began as determination had slowly become frustration. Frustration became doubt. Doubt became resignation. By late afternoon, several employees no longer referred to the vehicle by its model name. They simply called it the impossible one. During a management meeting later that day, the discussion turned toward cost, time, resources, customer expectations. The numbers were becoming difficult to ignore. Victoria listened carefully before finally asking the question nobody wanted to hear. Are we any closer than we were 3 weeks ago? Silence answered first. Then came cautious explanations. Additional testing was needed. More data would help. Certain possibilities remained under investigation. Victoria nodded politely. She understood what those answers really meant. Nobody knew. After the meeting ended, she returned to the service department one final time before leaving. The vehicle remained exactly where it had been all month. Bright lights reflected across flawless paint. Diagnostic equipment sat nearby. Toolboxes remained open. Yet the engine remained silent. One senior technician walked past and glanced toward the car. Maybe some things just do not want to be fixed. Several others laughed quietly, not because it was funny, because they were exhausted. Victoria looked at the vehicle for a long moment. Then she turned toward the exit. Outside, the sun was beginning to disappear beyond the city skyline. Employees headed home. Service bays closed for the evening. Another unsuccessful day ended. What nobody noticed was a delivery truck pulling into the rear lot as the dealership prepared to shut down. Inside sat a single father named Mason Carter. He was there to drop off a routine parts order. Nothing more. At least that was what everyone would assume. By the next morning, the impossible vehicle would still be silent. The experts would still be searching. And nobody inside the dealership had any idea that the man arriving with ordinary delivery paperwork was about to notice something every specialist in the building had somehow missed. The dealership was nearly empty by the time Mason Carter finished unloading the last crate from his truck. The service department lights still glowed across the rear of the building, but most employees had already gone home. To everyone around him, he was simply a parts supplier, completing another routine delivery. Nobody paid much attention. Mason preferred it that way. He signed the final paperwork and carried a small box through the service entrance. A young employee pointed toward the receiving desk without looking up. "Just leave it over there." Mason nodded. No argument. No conversation. As he turned to leave, his eyes drifted across the service floor. The silent vehicle immediately caught his attention. It was impossible not to notice, not because of its value, because of the unusual way it had been positioned. Diagnostic cables surrounded it. Specialized equipment stood nearby. Several panels had been removed and reinstalled multiple times. The signs were familiar. Many people had been searching for something. Many people had failed to find it. Mason slowed his pace for a moment. One technician noticed him looking. "Do not waste your time staring at that thing." A few nearby employees chuckled. "Trust me," another added. "Half the state has already tried." Mason glanced toward the vehicle again. Then he simply nodded. "Must be frustrating." The technician laughed. "That is one way to describe it." Mason continued toward the exit. Yet before leaving, he paused near the front corner of the vehicle, only for a second. His eyes moved across several details: the hood alignment, the placement of diagnostic equipment, a faint mark near one connector. Then he walked away without another word. The next morning, dealership operations resumed exactly as before. Meetings, service appointments, diagnostics. Frustration. Victoria Hayes arrived early for another update. The answers remained unchanged. Additional testing had produced nothing useful. New theories continued appearing. None solved the problem. By midday, another group of specialists gathered around the vehicle. Screens displayed technical data. Discussions became increasingly complex. One expert focused on software behavior. Another believed the issue originated within a sensor network. A third suggested replacing an expensive component entirely. Standing nearby, several technicians listened carefully. Nobody sounded confident anymore. Meanwhile, miles away, Mason was helping his 12-year-old daughter Emily prepare for school. She packed books into her backpack while he poured orange juice into a glass. "Busy day?" she asked. Mason smiled. "Probably." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "You always say that when something interesting is happening." Mason laughed softly. "Do I?" Emily grinned. "Every time." Later that afternoon, another parts delivery brought Mason back to the dealership. As he entered the service area, he noticed something immediately. The vehicle had not moved. The discussions had not ended. And the expressions on people's faces looked worse than yesterday. One technician walked past, shaking his head. Another closed a laptop with visible frustration. Mason set down a crate and glanced quietly toward the vehicle again. This time, his eyes settled on the same small detail he noticed the night before. The detail everyone else seemed determined to ignore. He said nothing. He simply looked for a moment longer. Then a faint smile appeared. For the first time since arriving at the dealership, Mason seemed to understand something nobody else did. By Thursday morning, curiosity had quietly replaced frustration inside part of the dealership. The vehicle still refused to cooperate. The specialists were still searching. Yet several technicians had started revisiting earlier assumptions. One diagnostic report led to another. One theory eliminated another. Hours passed. Answers remained elusive. Victoria Hayes stood beside the service bay listening as a senior specialist explained the latest findings. The presentation was detailed, professional, thorough, and completely inconclusive. When he finished, Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence said enough. Across the room, Mason Carter arrived with another scheduled delivery. He wheeled a cart loaded with parts toward the receiving area and completed his paperwork without drawing attention to himself. Most employees barely noticed him. A few recognized him from previous visits. To them, he was simply the quiet delivery driver who always arrived on time. As Mason passed the service bay, he glanced toward the vehicle once more. The same detail caught his eye immediately. The same detail nobody seemed interested in discussing. He slowed for a moment, then continued walking. One technician noticed. "You keep looking at that car." Mason stopped. "Just curious." The technician laughed. "You and everyone else." Another employee joined the conversation. "If you can fix it, be our guest." Several nearby workers smiled. Not cruelly, just tired. Mason nodded politely. "I doubt that." Then he continued toward the loading dock, yet the comment lingered. Later that afternoon, while several specialists reviewed diagnostic data, Mason returned to collect signed documents. The service department was quieter than usual. Most attention remained focused on computer screens. As he passed the vehicle again, he noticed a technician studying a component diagram. Mason stopped briefly. "Can I ask a question?" The technician looked surprised. "Sure." Mason pointed toward the screen. "Has anyone checked whether that reading is causing the other readings instead of the other way around?" The technician blinked. "What do you mean?" Mason considered the question. Then he simply shook his head. "Never mind." He started walking away. "Wait." The technician looked back at the diagram, then back at Mason. "Why would you ask that?" Mason smiled slightly. "Just something I noticed." Before the technician could continue, Mason was already heading toward the exit. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it immediately created a problem. Because the technician could not stop thinking about it. 30 minutes later, he reopened several reports. Then he reviewed historical data. Then he checked a series of measurements everyone had previously dismissed as unrelated. By evening, a small group of specialists had gathered around his workstation. Nobody was celebrating. Nobody was claiming a breakthrough. Yet for the first time in weeks, they were asking a different question. Not whether the vehicle had a problem, but whether they had misunderstood the problem entirely. Across town, Mason sat at the kitchen table helping Emily with mathematics homework. The atmosphere was calm, ordinary. Emily worked through equations while Mason reviewed a school newsletter. Finally, she looked up. "You are thinking about something." Mason smiled. "Am I?" Emily nodded confidently. "Yep." Mason laughed softly. "Maybe." Emily returned to her homework. Neither realized that back at the dealership, several highly trained specialists had just spent an entire evening investigating a simple observation from a man they assumed delivered boxes for a living. By Friday morning, the atmosphere inside the dealership had changed again. The frustration was still there, but something new had appeared beside it. Doubt. Not doubt about the vehicle. Doubt about the assumptions everyone had been making for weeks. The technician who spoke with Mason the previous day arrived early and immediately reopened several diagnostic records. He reviewed measurements that had been dismissed. He compared data collected weeks apart. Then he checked the sequence of events surrounding the original failure. The deeper he looked, the less comfortable he became. Shortly after 8 o'clock, a group of specialists gathered around his workstation. Victoria Hayes joined them a few minutes later. The technician explained what he had found. Several readings everyone believed were symptoms might actually be causes. Several causes everyone focused on might actually be consequences. The room became quiet. One senior expert crossed his arms. That would change everything. Another specialist nodded slowly. It would also mean we spent weeks looking in the wrong direction. Nobody liked hearing that, especially not people whose careers were built on solving difficult problems. Yet the data continued pointing toward the same conclusion. Victoria listened carefully. How did this come up? The technician hesitated. For a moment, he almost avoided the answer. Then he shrugged. The delivery guy asked a question. Several people looked confused. What delivery guy? Someone asked. The one who keeps bringing parts. A few specialists exchanged amused glances. One even smiled. And now we are following diagnostic advice from a delivery driver? The room filled with quiet laughter. Not cruel, just skeptical. The technician looked back at his screen. Maybe. The laughter faded quickly, because nobody had a better explanation. Throughout the day, the team tested the new theory. Results began appearing almost immediately. Not solutions. Clues. Real clues. For the first time in weeks, certain data points started making sense. Relationships that previously looked random now appeared connected. One specialist stared at a report for nearly 10 minutes before finally shaking his head. How did we miss this? Nobody answered. Meanwhile, Mason spent the afternoon repairing a riding mower for a neighbor. The work was straightforward, mechanical, honest, exactly the kind of challenge he enjoyed. Emily sat nearby reading a book beneath a tree. At one point, she glanced up. "Are you thinking about the dealership again?" Mason tightened a bolt and smiled. "Maybe a little." Emily nodded as if she expected that answer. "You think you know what is wrong with the car?" Mason looked at her. "What makes you say that?" She grinned. "Because you get that same look every time you already know the answer." Mason laughed quietly and returned to work. Back at the dealership, the specialists continued debating late into the evening. New evidence kept supporting the revised theory. Yet one question remained unanswered. If the delivery driver noticed something important after only a few visits, what exactly had he seen? And why did he seem completely uninterested in telling anyone? For the first time since the vehicle arrived, several experts stopped focusing on the engine and started wondering about Mason Carter. The answer should have been getting closer. Instead, the mystery seemed to grow larger with every test. By Monday morning, the dealership specialists had spent an entire weekend following the revised theory that began with a single question from Mason Carter. The new direction produced results, important results. Yet every breakthrough seemed to uncover another layer beneath it. Victoria Hayes stood beside the service bay reviewing the latest reports. For the first time in weeks, there was measurable progress. Certain systems were responding differently. Several readings finally made sense. Long-standing inconsistencies had disappeared. Yet the engine still refused to cooperate. The impossible vehicle remained silent. Around the service floor, confidence was beginning to crack. Not because the experts lacked ability, because they were running out of explanations. One specialist stared at a diagnostic screen and slowly shook his head. "This should have worked." Another nodded. "Everything says it should have worked." A third technician leaned against a toolbox. "Then why didn't it?" Nobody answered. Across the room, several employees exchanged frustrated looks. They had followed every procedure, verified every measurement, rechecked every component. The evidence suggested they were close. Yet, somehow they remained stuck. During an afternoon review meeting, Victoria finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. What are we missing? Silence followed. One expert suggested another round of testing. Another recommended replacing additional components. A third proposed expanding the investigation into related systems. None of the ideas sounded convincing. They sounded tired. That was when the technician who first spoke with Mason quietly raised his hand. What if we ask him? The room reacted immediately. Several people looked surprised. Others looked skeptical. One consultant even laughed softly. The delivery driver? The technician shrugged. His question got us farther than 3 weeks of meetings. Nobody argued with that. Because it was true. Victoria looked down at the reports spread across the table, then toward the service bay beyond the glass wall. The idea sounded unreasonable, yet the situation itself had become unreasonable weeks ago. Later that evening, Mason arrived with another shipment. The service department was still active despite the late hour. Several technicians noticed him immediately. The reaction felt different this time. Less dismissive, more curious. As Mason completed delivery paperwork, the same technician approached him. "Can I ask you something?" Mason nodded. "Sure." The technician glanced toward the vehicle. "What exactly did you see?" Mason looked across the room. For several seconds, he simply observed the car. Then he smiled slightly. "I saw something everyone else was trying too hard to explain." The technician frowned. "What does that mean?" Mason looked thoughtful. "Sometimes a problem survives because people keep looking for complicated answers." Before the technician could ask another question, Mason signed the final document and prepared to leave. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet once again, it left people thinking, deeply thinking. Across town, Emily sat at the kitchen table working on a school project while Mason prepared dinner. She watched him quietly for a moment. "You are smiling again." Mason looked up. "Am I?" Emily nodded. "That means you figured something out." Mason laughed softly. Then he returned to chopping vegetables. Back at the dealership, a room full of experts spent the evening debating one simple sentence. And for the first time, several of them began wondering whether the answer they were searching for had never been hidden at all. Tuesday evening arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation inside the dealership. For the first time in more than a month, people were no longer discussing what had failed. They were discussing what might finally work. Yet nobody felt comfortable saying it out loud. The vehicle still sat in the same service bay. The engine still remained silent. Hope had appeared before. Hope had disappeared before. Nobody wanted to repeat that cycle. Victoria Hayes stood beside the observation window overlooking the service department. Below her, technicians reviewed data one final time. Reports covered workstations. Diagnostic screens glowed beneath bright lights. Every specialist seemed focused on a different piece of the puzzle. Yet despite all the effort, one uncomfortable reality remained. They were still missing something. Around 6 o'clock, Mason Carter arrived with another scheduled delivery. Several technicians noticed him immediately. This time, nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed him. In fact, a few seemed relieved to see him. As Mason unloaded the final crate, the technician who first spoke with him approached again. "We are still stuck." Mason nodded. "Looks that way." The technician hesitated. Then he glanced toward the service bay. "Would you take a look?" Mason studied him for a moment. The request sounded sincere. Not mocking. Not sarcastic. Just honest. Before he could answer, Victoria appeared nearby. She had overheard enough to understand the conversation. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she surprised everyone. "Let him look." The service department became very quiet. Several specialists exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody objected. Nobody volunteered enthusiasm either. The situation had simply reached a point where pride no longer mattered. Results mattered. Mason walked toward the vehicle for the first time. No rush. No dramatic entrance. Just a man crossing a garage floor. The specialist stepped aside. Victoria watched from several feet away. Mason circled the vehicle slowly. He looked at things nobody expected him to examine. A connector. A mounting bracket. A section of wiring. A diagnostic history displayed on a screen. Then he stopped beside the engine compartment and remained perfectly still. Minutes passed. Nobody interrupted. Finally, Mason reached toward a specific area and pointed. When was the last time anyone checked this after the original repair? The nearest specialist frowned. That was verified weeks ago. Mason nodded. Verified how? The specialist explained the procedure. Mason listened carefully. Then he asked another question. A simple question. The kind that sounded almost too simple. Silence followed. Several technicians looked at one another. Nobody immediately had an answer. Mason stepped back. Maybe start there. That was all he said. No lecture, no explanation, no attempt to impress anyone. He simply returned to the paperwork waiting near the loading dock. The specialists immediately began investigating the area he identified. Within 30 minutes, the atmosphere changed. Conversations became faster. Focus sharpened. One technician called another over, then another. Diagnostic results started aligning in ways they never had before. Victoria watched the activity from across the room. Something was happening. Real progress. Not another theory, not another guess. Meanwhile, Mason finished his paperwork and prepared to leave. As he walked toward the exit, the technician caught up with him. You really think we are close? Mason smiled slightly. Then he looked back toward the service bay where experts were suddenly moving with renewed purpose. Closer than you were this morning. It was the last thing he said before disappearing into the evening. Behind him, a dealership full of specialists had just begun following the first trail that truly felt like it might lead to the answer. Wednesday morning began with something the dealership had not heard in over a month. Optimism. Nobody said it aloud. Nobody wanted to risk disappointment, yet it was there. The specialists arrived earlier than usual. Diagnostic screens filled with fresh data. New measurements continued confirming the path Mason Carter had quietly pointed them toward the previous evening. For the first time since the vehicle arrived, every major inconsistency appeared connected to a single source. Victoria Hayes stood inside the observation area, watching technicians move with renewed energy. Conversations sounded different, focused, purposeful. The endless speculation that had dominated previous weeks was gone. Now people were testing possibilities that actually fit the evidence. By late morning, a group of specialists gathered around the engine compartment. One technician reviewed final readings, while another compared them against original service records. Then, someone noticed something unusual. A tiny discrepancy buried inside documentation from the vehicle's earliest repair history. Small enough to overlook, significant enough to change everything. The discovery triggered another round of testing, then another. The service bay became intensely quiet. Nobody wanted distractions. Hours passed. Finally, shortly after 2 o'clock, a senior specialist stepped back from the vehicle and looked around the room. I think we found it. Nobody celebrated. Not yet. Too many previous breakthroughs had ended in disappointment. Victoria walked downstairs from her office and joined the group. Technicians completed the final verification process. Data aligned perfectly. Every unexplained symptom suddenly made sense. Every failed repair attempt finally had an explanation. The source of the problem had been hiding behind layers of misleading information for weeks, not because it was complicated, because everyone assumed it had to be complicated. The realization was almost painful. One specialist laughed quietly and shook his head. It was right there. Another nodded. The entire time. Several people exchanged stunned looks. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. A technician entered the vehicle. Others moved back. The service department fell completely silent. Victoria folded her arms and watched. Diagnostic equipment remained connected. Screens displayed live data. Nobody spoke. The technician pressed the ignition button. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then the engine came to life. The sound echoed across the service department. Smooth, strong, effortless. Every person in the room froze. Some stared at the vehicle. Others stared at the diagnostic screens. A few simply stood motionless as the reality settled in. After weeks of failure, endless meetings, countless tests, and growing frustration, the engine was finally running. Nobody cheered. The moment felt too surreal for that. Instead, silence spread across the room. The kind of silence that appears when people realize they have just witnessed something important. Victoria slowly exhaled. One question immediately entered her mind. Not what fixed the vehicle. She already knew that answer. The question was, who exactly was Mason Carter? Later that evening, Mason sat in the bleachers of a community softball field watching Emily practice. The sun was beginning to set. Parents chatted nearby. Children laughed across the field. His phone vibrated once, then again, then a third time. Messages from unknown numbers. Mason glanced at the screen. A small smile appeared. Emily noticed immediately. "Good news." Mason slipped the phone back into his pocket. Looks like somebody finally found what they were looking for. Across town, an entire dealership was celebrating a solved mystery. Yet the man responsible for leading them to the answer was sitting on a metal bench, watching his daughter play softball, acting as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The morning after the engine finally came back to life, the dealership felt different. Employees moved with lighter steps. Conversations carried energy instead of frustration. Customers who had heard rumors about the impossible repair began calling for updates. Yet, inside Victoria Hayes' office, attention had already shifted away from the vehicle itself. She wanted answers about the man who helped solve the problem. Shortly after arriving, Victoria asked her assistant to gather whatever information the company had on Mason Carter. The request seemed simple. The results were not. By noon, a folder sat on her desk. Victoria opened it, expecting to find a routine employment history connected to a regional parts supplier. Instead, she found gaps. Interesting gaps. Certifications. Technical training records. Consulting projects. Specialized manufacturer programs completed years earlier. The deeper she looked, the stranger the story became. Mason had spent years working around some of the most advanced performance vehicles in the country. Several credentials carried names that immediately caught her attention. A few were difficult to obtain. Others were nearly impossible. Victoria continued reading. One document referenced a technical symposium attended by elite engineers and diagnostic specialists. Another listed Mason as a guest instructor. She stopped reading and looked up. Instructor? Her assistant nodded. Apparently, he taught several advanced courses years ago. Victoria leaned back in her chair. The information felt increasingly difficult to reconcile with the quiet man delivering parts to the service department. Meanwhile, the discovery was spreading through the dealership. Technicians who once viewed Mason as a curious outsider were now asking questions of their own. One specialist searched old industry publications and found Mason's name attached to technical presentations. Another discovered archived interviews from years earlier. A third located training materials still being used in certain certification programs. The reactions were remarkably similar. Surprise, respect, confusion. By late afternoon, a group of specialists gathered around a workstation reviewing what they had found. One technician stared at a document and laughed softly. "You are kidding." Another looked over his shoulder. "What?" The technician pointed to the screen. "This training framework." He paused. "I used this during certification." A second specialist leaned forward, then a third. Within minutes, several people realized they recognized the material. Not because they knew Mason personally, because they had learned from work he created years earlier. Across town, Mason spent the evening helping Emily prepare a presentation for school. Construction paper covered the kitchen table. Markers, rulers, and notebooks were scattered everywhere. Emily carefully arranged information across a display board, while Mason offered occasional suggestions. The atmosphere was calm and familiar. At one point, Emily looked up from her project. "The dealership people keep calling, do they not?" Mason smiled. "A few of them." Emily nodded knowingly. "Because they finally figured out who you are." Mason laughed quietly. "I am pretty sure I know who I am." Emily smiled and returned to her work. Back at the dealership, however, that exact question was becoming the center of attention. Not because Mason claimed to be important. He never did. The mystery existed because every answer seemed to reveal another layer beneath it. And with each discovery, more people began realizing that the man who solved the problem overnight had spent years teaching others how to solve problems themselves. 2 weeks later, the vehicle had become one of the dealership's greatest success stories. Customers talked about it. Technicians referenced it. Industry contacts called asking questions. Yet the most important conversation had still not happened. Victoria Hayes finally decided it was time. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, she drove to a modest neighborhood on the edge of the city. The address came from company records. The house was simple, well-maintained. Flowers lined the front walkway. A bicycle rested near the porch. Nothing about the place suggested fame, prestige, or professional status. Victoria stepped from her vehicle and looked around. The scene felt surprisingly peaceful. In the backyard, she spotted Mason Carter repairing a wooden garden gate while Emily sat nearby reading. Neither seemed in a hurry. Neither appeared concerned about business, reputation, or recognition. For a moment, Victoria simply watched. Then Mason noticed her and smiled politely. "Good afternoon." Victoria returned the smile. "I hope I am not interrupting anything." Mason glanced toward the gate. "Nothing that cannot wait." They sat on the porch while Emily continued reading nearby. The conversation began simply. Victoria thanked him for helping the dealership. Mason nodded. Then the discussion shifted toward the discoveries made after the repair. The training programs, the certifications, the consulting work, the years of experience nobody knew about. Victoria finally shook her head. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Mason looked genuinely confused. "Tell them what?" Victoria laughed softly. "Who you are." Mason leaned back in his chair. People usually care more about results than introductions. The answer stayed with her. Because it explained everything. He never needed attention, never chased recognition, never corrected assumptions people made about him. He simply focused on solving problems. Victoria then presented an offer, not because she felt obligated, because she genuinely believed the dealership could benefit from someone like him. A senior leadership position, complete authority over technical development programs, compensation that reflected his expertise, the kind of opportunity many people spend decades pursuing. Mason listened carefully. Then he looked across the yard toward Emily. She was smiling at something inside her book. The afternoon sun illuminated the garden they had planted together. The moment felt calm, complete. Mason turned back toward Victoria. "That is very generous." Victoria waited. Mason smiled. "But I think I already have everything I need." For a second, neither spoke. Then Victoria nodded. Surprisingly, she understood. Completely. The conversation continued another hour. They discussed leadership, learning, mentorship. Not once did Mason speak about accomplishments, yet every story revealed quiet wisdom earned through years of experience. As evening approached, Victoria stood and prepared to leave. Before walking away, she paused. "You know, most people would have taken the offer." Mason smiled. "Most people are probably smarter than me." Emily immediately laughed from across the porch. "That is definitely not true." Victoria laughed as well. The sound felt light, genuine. As she drove away, she realized something important. The greatest experts are rarely the loudest people in the room. Sometimes they are the ones nobody notices until the problem becomes impossible. Back on the porch, Emily closed her book and looked at her father. "So what happens now?" Mason glanced toward the sunset settling across the neighborhood. Then he smiled. "Tomorrow?" Emily nodded. Mason stood and reached for the unfinished garden gate. "Tomorrow we finish fixing this." Emily grinned and followed him across the yard. The dealership finally understood his value. But the quiet life he built with his daughter had always been the success story that mattered most.